Many thanks. Wow.
Time no see.
Yeah.
Good. Where were you? Where have you been?
These are our PhD students.
Oh,
My colleague.
oh, okay.
Have you been home?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I went to Singapore last week, and then the week before I was in Indonesia.
So, will you be in Jakarta in September?
I will be for the
Oh, yes. Oh, is that? Yes, September.
so everyone's going.
Because we wait for the call for papers, then they can decide where to, whether they will submit or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually we only have one go to one conference, one in
Really?
the conference. So Josh, about an idea. Yeah, he's not around today. But I also want, yeah, let's maybe
let's
history for a few minutes. Here it is, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not super into it, but it's been for your menu.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Yun. Okay, call me Yun. Yun. Why Yun?
From Monash as well.
Oh, I see.
How long have you guys been together?
About,
Once a year, right?
yeah.
Yeah. You guys work in the research team or?
We used to.
Yeah, we used to, because we are in graduate programs. It's one of our.
And where are you now?
Currently, I'm in innovation lab.
In what lab?
Innovation lab.
Oh,
Yeah, the one
yeah,
downstairs.
the very fancy one.
Yeah.
And how are you?
I mean, financial surveillance.
So you guys like have to move around.
Yeah.
Around every 6 months.
I see. Yeah.
A period of 18 months.
And this is like which one are you?
This project is under our second.
Shall we start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Very pleased to have you, and very pleased to have Aaron and then Chi Yun from BNM, Bank Negara Malaysia, to have a presentation on fiscal fatigue, cross-country and empirical analysis. So before I turn to the presenters, I just want to give a shout out to everyone, and then just the way we would work on this is like they're going to give an hour presentation. Please feel free to ask your questions. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and then come to the mic and then ask your question, and then we'll have an hour presentation. And after that, we can hang out outside for coffee and then chat with the presenters as well. So with that, over to you, Aaron. And then
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. So good afternoon to everyone. My name is Yun, and my colleague here, Aaron. And today we will be presenting our joint analysis on empirical analysis on fiscal fatigue. So before we deep dive into the concept of fiscal fatigue, let's talk a bit about the motivation about this project. So how are we motivated to do this analysis? So due to the increase of sovereign debt globally during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we this have relied the debate surrounding the debt sustainability. So this also somehow motivated us to study the sovereign debt in Malaysia, as well as some major economies such as China or United States, and as well as some countries which has some economic linkages in Malaysia. So conceptually, there are two limits that decide on the how much the government can spend on. So the first one is a statutory limit, and the second one is an endogenous limit. And as the word tells, statutory limit is the limit where the government spend is decided by the legal approval. And the second one, the endogenous limit, if I explain in more layman terms, is just depend on the country can spend depend on their ability. So our focus here will be using the indicator here we are using today is the debt to GDP ratio. So that's the idea of the limits or how much the government can spend. And we are focusing on endogenous limit now. And the fiscal fatigue proposition is rely on the assistance on this endogenous limit. And why is it useful? Because if that is a case of fiscal fatigue, we can judge how much we can spend. Let's say like if we spend until 50% of GDP to debt ratio, so if the limit is the 60%, so maybe we have the 10% limit to spend on without breaking into the bankruptcy or whatsoever. So that's the idea of surveillance use cases. And it also can be act as the indicators or expected level of fiscal surplus or deficit. So this is how we gonna use the fiscal fatigue concept of it. So the idea of fiscal fatigue can be explained using this graph. So the graph over here, the x-axis is the lagged government debt, and the y-axis is the primary balance. So primary balance is basically the fiscal balance minus out the net interest payment on the private debt. So that's the idea of it. So at a very low level of debt, the prime balance and the lagged debt should have a very big relationship. So there is like not much interaction between these two variables. And by the lagged debt increases, the primary balance will rise along with the lagged debt with diminishing responsiveness. And when we came across the endogenous limit, we pass over the endogenous limit, and the prime balance will decrease sharply with the lagged debt. And because the ability to increase the prime balance cannot keep pace with the rising debt. So in case that you might come across a bit hard to understand in the concept of using the government as an example. So let me be using a more simple example to understand this scenario. So put the case on as an individual case. So let's say you are a person earning 3,000 ringgit for the case, and if you just lend for like 10 ringgit, so doesn't matter that how much you own, so you can pay back anyhow because you have the ability to do so. But by the moment you increase the debt by the time, so you will aware of how much you need to pay back for the debt that you own. And if let's say your debt increases up to like more than your income level, so you'll be more on concern of it will be more on concern that you don't have an ability to pay back. So that's the idea of it. So this is the idea of the fiscal fatigue. So if we zoom in using Malaysia scenario, and if we are using the Malaysia scenario as an example, so the left-hand side graph is there are two lines over there. The first line, the red line, are the cyclically adjusted primary balance, and the black line are the government debt. So as you can see, the trend of these two indicators are actually closely trade throughout the time. So however, the CAPB tends to be lower when the debt is higher. So that's the observation we can observe so far. And we also can observe that the government debt is actually creep right below the statutory debt limit. So it is more likely reflecting that the government debt in Malaysia scenario is a policy-driven scenario rather than an endogenous one. So that's the idea of this for Malaysian scenario. And for another example, using Chile, which is a comparable A-rated emerging market economy, is actually, if you observe for the debt, is actually well below in statutory limit. So it might be reflecting a long-term fiscal conservatism. So more or less, these two examples is not really a good example to reflecting the existence of fiscal fatigue. But since there is a idea of fiscal fatigue, so we are interested to explore using more countries like the other study does. So we went more deep dive to the literature review, and there are mixed evidence on the existence of fiscal fatigue across the country. So basically, you can see there are three groups of the results from the past studies. So the first one is the homogeneous fiscal fatigue. How to understand the homogeneous fiscal fatigue is that there is evidence of fiscal fatigue, and the debt to GDP ratio is homogeneous across the country. So if they found the evidence of fiscal fatigue happen at 150% debt to GDP ratio, it will be applicable for all the country in the study. So that's the idea for homogeneous fiscal fatigue. And for heterogeneous fiscal fatigue, it means that there is a presence of fiscal fatigue, but the ratio might be different across the country, and no fiscal fatigue, there is no evidence of it. So as we observe, most study actually covers just only the advanced economies, which we came across that it might be not really supporting for the emerging economy. And yeah, and also we also noticed that there are mixed estimated form of fiscal reaction function. So this might become maybe some issue for the study also. And we also noticed that there are wide range of the debt ratio at which a fiscal fatigue kicks in. And as you can observe, there are some papers suggest that it's about 170% of GDP debt is there where the fiscal fatigue kicks in. And also there are some papers just suggesting around about 100% something. And we also noticed that some paper could be politically motivated, such as the paper from Gorsado, because his institution is IMF, which is related to government debt. So that's why we could say that could be politically motivated to do so. So the conclusion that trying to tell might be is the political agenda they trying to tell us also. So that's the brief summary of the literature review. And yeah, and based on now I'm showing some standardized fact using the country that we are focusing for this scenario. And the sample of country we are selecting here is, of course, first one we have Malaysia in our scenario because we are in Malaysia. And we selected some major economies such as United States, and also we have selected some country which has economy linkages. So this is how we select a sample of country. And also due to some data issues, so that's why we eventually filtered out just only 18 countries in our study. And for your information, for this graph, the x-axis is the led government debt, and the y-axis is the primary balance, cyclically adjusted primary balance, which both they are the percentage of GDP. And as you can observe, most of the government debt is actually scattered around it's actually static to a certain percentage of GDP. So as it's actually appear to be a vertical, scattered around a vertical line. So as you can see, it's like scattered around like 70% of the GDP. And for Malaysia, it's like scattered around 50 to 60% debt to GDP ratio. So this is what we observe. And from the for the one who are more than 100% of debt to GDP ratio is able to be only in Italy, Japan, and United States. So this is what we observe. And if we combine all the data point to, yeah.
Can you go to the previous slide? Is there a particular reason why Japan is so dispersed, the data points? Like there's so much variance in Japan's spending as a debt to GDP, their debt to GDP ratio?
So this is just a purely unadjusted data.
Yeah.
So it's just plotting at this year, what is the debt to GDP? And on the y-axis, we have the primary balance. So the variance is basically a function of the historical values of the debt to GDP. So it's just reflective of the trend.
Yeah, but is there like any like historical event of why it's like you said, most of the countries they are relatively static for their debt to GDP ratio in certain years. Is there any reason why Japan's one is so, some years they are spending so much and some years they're spending so less?
My guess is actually their effort to try to anchor their deflation over time. So that's why it's actually quite different from other countries.
Okay.
So that's my guess.
Alright.
Because I do not have much deep dive in Japan economy, so I couldn't give you a very concrete answer. Yeah. And thanks for the questions. Yeah.
I think you can also use the series results.
Do you mind coming to the mic so that all
Yeah.
It can also be as a result of
Yeah.
a series of earthquake and crises in Japan. So this usually will trigger spending, pushing the impact. That will explain why the Japan look a bit different from ours.
Okay. Thank you for your feedback. Yeah. So if we combine all the data point, regardless of the country, to be one plot, so we can observe that actually there is a very weak relationship between the unadjusted, selectively adjusted primary balance and also like government debt. So we couldn't say there is a positive relationship or negative relationship like we wish to look at, try to present the idea of fiscal fatigue. So that's the stylized fact using the sample country that we have now. And for the remaining part, I will pass to my colleague to present.
Thanks, Yun. So just a quick recap in case there are too many information going on. So the research question is very simple. We just want to find out, is there a universal magic threshold in terms of debt limit that can be applied to all countries? So for example, if your debt to GDP ratio is above 150%, that's a sure sign that your economy will not be able to sustain it. So that's the simple question. And now let's look at the methodology that we employ. So in terms of the methodology, it's just a very simple, static, non-linear fiscal reaction function. So what we're trying to do is to, to investigate the relationship that we saw in the cubic graph earlier on, where our primary balance is the y-axis, the variable that we're interested in. And we want to see how that is reacting to the debt to GDP ratio in terms of the dynamic. So here is just a simple cubic function to mimic the shape of the cubic polynomial. The reason is because there is a cutoff point in the turning point, right? So if we do observe some type of conformity to that function, then we might have some evidence for fiscal reaction function. And everything else is just there to provide the controls and in order to support the theory and also control for other factors that can affect the primary balance. So this is the main equation. And after that, in terms of the estimation steps, it's also quite standard. So as a starting point, we just ran a simple pool OLS to see if there's any discernible pattern when we pull all the countries together. And after that, we then proceeded to control for country fixed effects and use an AR1 error structure to take into account serial correlation. And as a step further, we also did two-way fixed effect to also see if there are any particular years, for example, during the crisis throughout our sample period, what will that also affect our result and how will that affect the outcome. And finally, other than trying to prove if there's a universal magic number, we also did try to look at the individual countries, run the same equation, and see if what's the result, is it significant, and what kind of range of the limit that is predicted according to this model. So a bit more specific on why we choose annual data is because in terms of data availability for all our variables, that's one of the key reasons. And another reason is because if we look at within year primary balance, they tend to fluctuate seasonally because maybe it's according to the fiscal cycle of the particular country. So we can also control for that. And one of our advantage on this paper and our sample is we try to not be biased at all. We try to include as many countries as we can because previous studies in the literature, they tend to focus on certain regions. But in our case, we want to really just answer a very basic question. Regardless if you are advanced or emerging economy, is there a debt limit that that we can follow and be like, oh, you shouldn't exceed 150%. If you exceed, then we will run into some trouble.
Is there any particular reason why you choose an AR1 error structure, or like why not AR2 or AR3?
So we did try to run AR2 and AR3, but in terms of the results, it's still the same. And we chose AR1 because we follow the Gauge paper, and they also did some analysis on using AR1. And later on during the robustness test, we actually did try to run a dynamic panel instead of a static. So yeah, later on when we reach that part, I will explain further. If there are no questions, I think we can proceed to look at the results.
Sorry, Aaron, can I just jump in for a clarifying question? This is Agustin.
Hi, Agustin. He's one of
Yeah,
our reviewers.
Just one question. I think I actually did that in the when I revised your paper, but I'm still a little bit confused about two things. One is basically the motivation of your question, because in my mind and knowing very well the sovereign debt literature, there is no reason to believe that there is like a natural debt limit for all countries. I think there is already a lot of literature that show what are the variables that affect debt sustainability, right? So just one question is why or what motivates your question, and the second is, I mean, how this model and how this regression will answer that question. So what should we be expecting to look in your coefficients to see whether or not this natural debt limit exists? Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the motivation, I do recognize that it's slightly different from the usual sovereign debt literature popularized by Arellano and Bond. So the main difference here is in their setup, the theoretical foundation is based on a strategic decision on the part of the government to decide whether or not to enter into a default. But what we are trying to do here is to just look at purely from a more empirical point of view. And if there is a debt limit, if we exceed it, we will see a very stark negative impact on the primary balance. So that's just a distinction. And in terms of the motivation, really is to try to, see from just purely an empirical stand view, is there really basis to say that there is some universal numbers that we can plug from the air and be like, oh, 150%, don't exceed that. So I guess intuitively, most people will already recognize that, that's quite a flawed thinking. But I guess the purpose of the paper is to just be more conclusive and show like why this approach might not be the best, and what are some of the other approaches that can be used in order to really ascertain the precise figure that we want, right? Yeah. Sorry, what's the second question?
Thank you very much.
Just thinking, when I look at the time period,
There's also a mic there, so if you want to come closer to the table, then.
I want to sit here.
when I look at the time period, I can see that there is 1999 Asian crisis that falls into that time period. I can see 2008 financial crisis falling into that time period. And I can also see the COVID. So did you control for the impact of this?
Yes, so that will be controlled in the two-way fixed effect. And later on, we also explicitly control for them in terms of adding dummy variables for those specific years.
Sorry, just to follow up on Agustin's question about the motivation for the question. So if the objective is to find that this magic number for all countries, I assume that the result would also depend on like the set of countries that go into the analysis. Have you tried different sets of countries, for example, by either adding the set of countries or reducing the number of countries?
Yes, so we'll go into that. We'll do all the sensitivity, and we will explain what's like the key finding when we, drop the sample size.
Shall we proceed?
Okay, so let's look at the plain vanilla results. So in this table, the first three the first three columns after the variables column. If you look at it, these are the results where we use the full sample size. So only the pool OLS, the ones bolded, basically the first three rows, lag depth square, lag depth cubic. These are basically the coefficient for your polynomials from the function earlier on. So what we want is we need to find evidence that the lag depth cubic term is negative, because only if it's negative, it will reflect the shape that we want, that will portray some kind of cutoff, some kind of fall from a maximum turning point. But if you look at fixed effect and two-way fixed effect, we don't observe that. The cubic term, the lag depth is not negative, it's positive. So here is already kind of suggesting that there's really no basis for any kind of universal fiscal fatigue or debt limit. And when we look at the controls, so basically the three rows below all the rows, in terms of the expected results that we see of these controls with our dependent variable, it's quite expected. So when real GDP increases, we expect our primary balance to improve. And when current account is positive, your fiscal balance will also be positive. So this is also kind of consistent with the twin deficit hypothesis, where when you run a current account deficit, it will also be reflected in your fiscal balance. And in terms of inflation-wise, we can see that marginally speaking, when inflation rises, there is some positive effect on your primary balance because your tax receipts will benefit and your real debt value will decreases. So in terms of the intuition from the controls itself, is quite consistent with our general expectation. But even if we drop all controls, the last three columns, we do see that the expected results in terms of the shape of the cubic polynomial is still very consistent with what we found. So again, pool OLS do really exhibit some level of strong evidence here that there might be fiscal fatigue, but once we control for country fixed effects and two-way fixed effects, including the time that I mentioned, then that evidence is really not as strong anymore. So yeah, two main takeaways here. There's really no magic threshold. And at best, what we can say is there might be, some kind of heterogeneous threshold depending on the country, right? So then when we proceeded to play around with the sample selection, so the next slide. So remember earlier on when we were looking at the scatter plot of the descriptive statistics, we realized that at the higher end of the debt to GDP limit, debt to GDP ratio, it's really mostly driven by Italy, Japan, and the US, right? So what happens if we drop them from the sample size? What happens now to our results? So basically, these two plots are the fitted line of the cubic estimation that we have done. So on the left-hand side, it's the full sample, and if you look at the limit itself, it's around 100% debt to GDP ratio. But when you drop the upper tail end of the data, it reduces to 80%. So here you can really see it's really sensitive to our sample selection. And as you know, the three countries that we remove are mostly advanced economies. So maybe here you can also see some kind of hypothesis that advanced economies tend to have a higher debt limit than emerging economies. Another interesting observation is even though there is a turning point, but there's no steep cutoff, right? Because what matters is how steep it is, the gradient. Because if it's not too steep, then it means it's perhaps still a manageable situation for the country to get by. So after this, what we then proceeded to do is to try to figure out if there's any country-specific threshold. So that will be in the next slide. So here is the same. It looks complicated, but it's just running the same equation, but at the country level. So this is using the cubic specification. And if you look at the highlighted countries, Colombia, France, Japan, Spain, UK, and the US, these are the countries that exhibit fiscal fatigue, where it's proven by the negative coefficient of the cubic function, the cubic coefficient. And among these countries, you can see it tends to be mostly advanced economy once again. And later on, we will look at what these countries that have evidence for fiscal fatigue, what is the implied debt limit. But the next thing that we do is to try to run a simple quadratic function instead. So let me go to the next slide. So yeah, now we see that the list of country has increased, given by those highlighted in green. So what's the rationale of choosing quadratic instead of cubic? We also know that quadratic has a simple turning point. So the idea is if it's a quadratic specification, chances are the implied debt limit, the turning point would be a lot lower. So this is also consistent with what we found. So in terms of the countries that are being highlighted here, we see there's also quite a balanced mix of advanced and emerging economy.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
I think when you started the presentation, you were talking about how you want to take a more general approach, throw everything in and see whether you can get one number for every country. So I'm just wondering, now that you're now taking a step back and like splitting the countries, how do they compare to what is already in the literature? And is there any difference between what you find and what is already in?
So in terms of the literature, I guess what they're trying to do more often than not is to find like a common threshold, maybe among the group of European countries, right? So they don't really deep dive into the individual countries, and they also don't really play around with the sample selection. Yeah, so in terms of what we find here later on, when we compare the actual predicted limit and what they have been in the past, like do they exceed or are they below the limit? Then do we observe countries going into bankruptcy? And that's where we can see, for more reasons than not, why this approach might not be the best. But in terms of some of the general findings, it's still pretty consistent with what we would expect, like advanced economies having a higher debt limit than emerging economies. Okay, so coming back to this, the chart, the main idea between this and the one previously is to just show you that if it's quadratic, highly likely the implied debt limit is lower, and therefore there are now more countries that qualify for the fiscal fatigue phenomenon when there is a lower debt. Then the next slide looks a bit messy as well, but this is where we plot out fully the individual countries and their implied debt limit. So for the top, it's based on the cubic function. The one at the bottom is based on the quadratic function. And basically, I'll summarize what we find, but if you're interested, you can see the charts more clearly in the paper itself. So what we do find is that in terms of the threshold, once we plotted and when we compare, when we look at the threshold estimated for advanced economies, they tend to be higher than 80% debt to GDP ratio. So comparing it to the literature is very consistent in that it is of a higher value, where that threshold for advanced economies, they tend to be more than 100% according to what we survey from the literature. But when we do it for the quadratic function, and some EMEs now also exhibit fiscal fatigue, then what happens now when we look at their debt to, when we look at the threshold? So when we look at all these emerging economies, we also see that it conforms to the literature in that most of the estimated thresholds, they tend to be lesser than 80% of debt to GDP ratio. So really what we find here is that it's quite consistent, where advanced economies should have a stronger debt to GDP limit because of maybe better fiscal governance, and just because of how well developed and more established they are compared to the emerging economies. So now when we run a bit of robustness checks, so these are the three kind of different robustness checks that we try to run on the model. So the first one is like what I alluded to earlier, where we try to transform the model into a dynamic panel by simply allowing for the lag term of primary balance. So what we see here is really there are no like substantial changes in the results. So we also decided to retain the original model because the AR1 error structure might be sufficient to account for serial correlation. And when we do explicitly try to account for crisis period, what we do see is there is some mixed estimates in terms of coefficient for the crisis dummy. The reason being because it's a large sample of various different countries. Some countries might fare a lot better than the rest. So there's really not much insightful results that we can say for sure. So that's why we also decided to retain the model, because it's also not significant in terms of the coefficient. And finally, the third robustness check that we have done is simply just dropping all the controls, and the results we have already seen earlier from the earlier chart. And it's also pretty consistent with what we found in the initial model. And in summary, there's no universal magic threshold, but fiscal fatigue, as we saw when we dive deeper into the individual countries, could possibly exist at different levels of depth for some countries. And what we also find that the reaction functions tend to be heterogeneous across countries. So what we are doing here is effectively imposing the same reaction function, but by right, it shouldn't be that case, because we have seen from our results, it really differ a lot. And whenever we do, even if we do find like some type of debt limit, it tends to be higher for the advanced economies. So this also provides some sanity check that the results are consistent with our intuition. And finally, I guess we still haven't really found like a good approach to really answer what's really driving the different responses when we talk about the implied threshold, right? So is there a way that we can cater to individual countries using different fiscal reaction function specification for each of those countries? So those are areas that can potentially improve the estimate of the threshold. And yeah, I guess that's the end of our presentation. So yeah, you can scan the QR code and read the full paper if you are interested. But if there are any questions, please feel free to let us know.
In terms of the economic significance questions, what can you conclude from the results?
No universal number. Advanced economies have higher debt limit than emerging economies.
Referring to the magnitude of
the magnitude of the coefficient.
not the sign.
Right.
What did you observe from the coefficient?
So I don't think the magnitude would give us any meaningful. We can't like say for certain, oh, if inflation increased by 1%, then I expect my primary balance to decrease by X%, because again, this is a panel data setting. So what we can at least sanity check is in terms of the direction. So as long as the direction makes sense, then we know that nothing funny is going on with the model. So I wouldn't be confident myself with the coefficients as well, because as we are fully aware, when we drop the sample selection, the coefficients changes drastically. But what's consistent at least is the sign of the coefficient.
I have a question, somewhat related to the question that Augustin mentioned earlier about the motivation for this like magic number.
Yeah.
I guess it's more about like the thinking process and maybe this is more relevant from BNM perspective. Like, is it helpful for like, let's say, a central bank, BNM, but also maybe other countries' central bank as well, to have like a magic number that you can target? Is that the reason why this research would be potentially useful? Like if there's almost like a rule of thumb, like let's say some number is that limit, having any that's above that, it's potentially harmful, and so maybe that's helpful for policy discussions. Is that potentially a reason for this?
Yes. So we also want to focus more on Malaysia, but I think some of our other colleagues are doing another paper that's trying to just map out what's the threshold for Malaysia itself. Yeah, so that's also one of the motivation. But I guess what we are doing here is a bit more macro in picture to really tell us that this approach is not the best, and if we want to find any threshold for the matter, we need to really take into account what's the country-specific debt dynamics.
Can I jump in?
And what's
Sorry, go Daniel, go Daniel.
no, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a follow-up on Daniel's question. I mean, I was about to ask why not applying this to Malaysia to try to understand, like, I mean, what is the threshold for Malaysia for debt sustainability, right? Because I think something that it can be useful to do is instead to just to put a bunch of economies that are very heterogeneous and try to find a magical number that, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is no reason to believe it exists. Maybe what you can do is to try to get a sample of countries that are very similar to Malaysia in different aspects, in economic development, access to financial markets, specific characteristics of the debt instrument, right? Because it's not the same. I mean, the maturity of the debt matters, the denomination of the debt matters. So it will be nice to get a sample of countries that are similar to Malaysia, and try to see whether there is a magic number for these countries that and maybe to see where is Malaysia relative to that number. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think we did try to consider regionally, maybe ASEAN, for example, how would that play out? But I guess what we found when we play around with the sample selection is really the results differ too much when we drop the sample size. So I don't think there's really any intuition on why we still want to do it from a regional point of view.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't think the point was to make it region-wise, but countries with similar characteristics, like Chile, you were referring to it. I think it's more like, do they have the same characteristics? Can we find this threshold then for, if this country has X, Y, Z, then do we see that this number will be good for them? And then for another set of countries that are a little different, but you can pull them together regardless of region, then it'd be interesting to
I think, if I'm not actually, we do consider to take the samples of the country which has a similar characteristic as the Malaysia scenario, but we actually encountered quite a challenging scenario where even though there's a similar economic characteristic, sometimes their monetary policy is quite different from our as our case of scenario. So even though there might be some similarity in terms of XYZ aspect, it might be quite different from another ABC aspect. So it somewhat will be similar outcome as our paper suggests. So that's what we actually thought. That's our DP process.
And when we ran the country-specific equations, we also see that for the case of Malaysia, we don't really observe any fiscal fatigue. And just now, when we dive deeper into just Malaysia, we see that the pattern there is more closely reflecting the statutory limit, right? Because we see when the statutory debt limit increases, then that's where our debt to GDP also increases.
The result for China.
I wonder if you're able to get earlier data. We started from 1993, right?
Yeah.
I'm quite sure earlier data is available, and moreover, with like 30 years of time series, and 18 countries, dynamic panel may not be very ideal. And I'm pretty sure that there could be endogeneity issue in the model, right?
Yes.
So with dynamic panel, it will be better to have a longer time series. That is something that you can explore.
Yes.
Yeah, that's definitely we can we are interested, but we are stick to starting from 1993 is just want to have a standardized of the length of the data because due to a choice of the variables that we included in the model. So that's why we start at quite a later time. So yeah, we appreciate this opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Did you train extreme outliers sometimes they can also cause fluctuations where the result differ significantly from because if 2 or 3 outliers can bring the size of the question. So watch out, especially for countries like Japan or China. They are totally different. Behavior is different from other countries. And I was thinking, when you run country by country, then you are running with 29 time periods. So if it is country by country, it's not that bad. It's like a time series.
Yeah.
So from your estimation, you gave us the time. So I can see time series specification.
So in terms of, yeah, thanks for the suggestion. I think, yeah, it's true that we can, try to maybe play around with the outliers and see if it changes the results. But for the specification of the country specific, yeah, you're right. It's indeed just a time series regression. So the specification is the same as the panel, but instead of it being panel, it's just that 29 observations that we have for each country. And the coefficients are in the heat map. Yeah.
Which one?
Slide 12, 13. Yeah, so the coefficients for each of the country-specific measures are here.
Is a quarterly version of the regression possible or not? Because it would like quadruple your data points, right?
I think that's the trade-off. If we wanted more data, then maybe we have to consider less controls because of the availability in terms of the different frequency.
So what's the next steps and future research questions coming out from this results? Where do you want to take this next?
So our colleagues will be looking to the next level. So a lot of you have, pointed to the same direction. How does this apply to Malaysia? So we are also looking into just modeling for Malaysia specifically. So hopefully that research will be done soon and will also be shared here with everyone.
So another simple question, like in the US, there's this like some debt limit that's set by Congress for like a 31.4 trillion US dollars, right? Like, is there something similar in Malaysia that's like predefined in the regulation or like the law?
Our limit is somewhere about 65% debt to GDP ratio. So we are using debt to GDP ratios, and that's why we are using here also. It's not like they are using a concrete number like the US does.
So I think it's like subject to the parliament, or I could be wrong, but it's flexible, but it needs to be discussed and approved, and before we can move the statutory limit higher. So in the past, I think we were 45% in 2009, but in 2021 we have already increased it to 65%.
So it's actually increased. The statutory debt limit is actually increased from time to time. So that's why you can see the trend is actually increased from time to time. So,
and I guess in the case of the US, they are also kind of similar, where every time when they are approaching a limit, then you see a big hoo-ha, like, are they going to increase the limit so that they can fund the government? And it's different because they are also like the reserve currency. So in terms of dynamic wise, it will be quite distinctive to compare.
Yeah, and also Malaysia is actually quite, compared to states, we are actually a small country. So actually our economy is actually depending on many external factors also. Yeah. So there's more things to be considered as compared to the states.
One thing I was thinking was that, okay, since most countries are moving by a statutory limit, so if what you're kind of thinking of is that, is there a number where if you exceed this debt to GDP ratio, it could potentially be damaging to the economy? But if the statutory limit has never ever been close to such a degree, then you don't really observe how like it hits, because there is no observation which reflects damage done to the economy from exceeding this optimum limit? So are there any countries where the statutory limit was above the threshold where it would be damaging for the economy? Then maybe from there you could see the effect.
Yeah, so that's actually a very good observation, which we also found, because like you mentioned, like most of these countries, they don't really experience like any, like in the past, they don't really experience any severe downturn because of sovereign debt crisis.
Yeah.
So if you, later on in the paper, there's also a section where we compare the threshold. So what we found is actually, even though the threshold has been exceeded by some countries, they are still fine. So chances are, like you pointed out, there's this downward bias that we also have to account for, which we can't in this specification. Yeah, but your suggestion of using countries that have clearly experienced
Maybe like now Greece. I'm not really familiar, but is that some possibility?
I think we did consider Greece, but due to the data availability, so we excluded it eventually. Yeah. Else we are very interested to understand there also.
But I think if we use Greece, chances are we will be able to find a more logical and unbiased turning point, because there's like data that really clearly showed that it has happened.
Yeah.
If you control quality of financial market in each country,
Financial market, we didn't, right?
Not explicitly, maybe you'll fall in the fixed effect.
in all of this, the key is financial market.
Yes.
The level of financial market is another key. Where you're studying debt sustainability, then it's the yield through
The credit rating. Yeah, so that's also partly our motivation to drop the controls, because there are really a lot of controls when we think about things that really influence the primary balance. But when we drop all controls, what we observe is, at least from our main takeaway of saying there's really no magic number, that conclusion is still sound. Yeah. But when it comes to really pinpointing the magic number for each country, I think that's why we need a different paper.
Any last questions before we close?
In the another control institution quality, because in the literature they found that a better institution will have a better research that in the better institution. For example, that you have the NDP and the sample period is 30 observation, you can consider the second generation time series pattern by using the thing like cross-sectional dependent institution, then using, let's say, the dynamic correlated group as well as the panel ARDR for see this speak on it as well. Okay, so thank you for sharing this.
Thanks for your suggestions.
Okay. Going once, going twice. Okay. So thank you very much for that really excellent presentation. We really enjoyed the presentation and the discussions. Looking forward to future presentations as well from BNM, especially a follow-up on this topic. But yeah, and thank you for attending. I would just like to give an attention to the QR code there. If you could please take a scan of that and then just provide a quick survey. It's just how you're satisfied with the seminar, and any feedback for the future as well. And there will be coffee outside, so please hang out. You're welcome to talk more with the speakers and then ask more questions and maybe explore future collaborations as well. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.